As you may have guessed by the title of this episode, we are talking about endings of stories. If you prefer not to be spoiled, this may be an episode you might have to skip. Otherwise, feel free to listen and fast forward at your discretion. Hope you enjoy. I hate when there's a sad ending and they don't give me enough recovery time to stop crying. So I'm like, if there's something sad, like let's pick any Marvel movie. There's always like a downturn, right? They always want to make you cry at some point, and usually it's not the very ending. So I'm thankful because I'll cry and then I'll be like, all right, I've got some time to dry out a little bit until the lights come up.
Yeah, you need a minute to pick yourself back up before you walk out of the theater.
Welcome to Speculative Sandbox, your audio playground for creative storytellers. My name is Vicky Lawn, and each episode, I and a guest will unpack a fiction trope with an eye for character development and narrative structures. Make sure to look for Speculative Sandbox on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter, where you can join the conversation. Leave comments or questions, or let us know what other tropes we should cover. When the real world just doesn't cut it, let's get lost in a fictional one. Have you ever watched a movie all the way to the end to discover every single character dies? Or the heroes lose the mission, or whatever outcome you wanted to happen just didn't happen? Whether the story's ending was meant to prove a point or just make you sad, unhappy endings certainly send us off feeling some sort of way. Elizabeth Brown joins me in a discussion about unhappy endings. We'll be focusing on a wide range of genres for this one, including some non-speculative fiction stories, because plot structure will be our main focus. We'll talk about good and bad examples, including some famous happy endings that maybe should have been unhappy ones. All right, so Liz, thank you so much for joining me on Speculative Sandbox. Tell me about yourself and the stories that you like to read.
So I think one of the first things to get out of the way is I'm utterly unqualified to be on this podcast. I'm not a writer. I don't have a liberal arts degree. And I don't work in anything remotely related to the literary field. I'm a nurse, which means I'm the worst person in the world to watch any movie or TV show that involves CPR, because I will automatically grade their CPR skills. I am married to a writer, though, and he was actually the first podcast guest. And by the time this episode comes out, he will have had a second episode, I think. But
so you have to live with the writer, so you know the lifestyle.
I do. And I love to read. I thought about being a humanities major before I realized that I did not have the endurance for writing all those essays. But I read a bunch, watch a lot of movies, and being married to a writer means we have a lot of nitpicky discussions about plot points and character arcs and everything like that. And I get to do a lot of beta reading. So I'm sort of tangentially on the fringes of that group. As far as, it's so hard to say, stories you enjoy reading. Like, what did I say? I like fiction. That kind of is a little bit too broad. I love kind of things that are straddle the fantasy sci-fi story kind of line. I love anything that has like horror elements to it, even if it's not strictly horror. My favorite writers, I love Garth Nix. I grew up reading the Old Kingdom series with the Sabriel, Lyriel, Horson books, and then I got my husband on them a couple of years ago. I love Stephen King. We have a whole shelf in our bookcase that is all just Stephen King books. And then more recently, I've been loving Andy Weir's books, for more of like the modern, hard science fiction kind of stuff.
Did you read his Project Hail Mary yet?
Yes.
Yeah.
So actually, my husband and I, since we've been together, we go on vacation for a week in the summer, and we do this book club thing where every year we take turns and one of us gets to pick a book. We buy 2 copies. We start it the first day of vacation, and we kind of read it together and discuss and everything. And one year we did The Martian, and then last summer we did Project Hail Mary, and we were going on vacation with my dad. My dad is a huge nerd. He's an engineer. He loved The Martian, and so we actually got him a 3rd copy, and he did it with us. And it was like a wild time
discussing like the pseudoscience. Yeah, I love.
Yeah,
me and my coworker also read Project Hail Mary, and we were like, I think we know enough to get in trouble. We're not sure.
Yes. Oh yeah. You finish reading The Martian and you're like, oh, I could survive in space.
Yeah.
I could propagate my own potatoes.
Yep.
I'm a physicist. Yeah, I love his writing. It's such a great mix of he gives you so much information, but it's somehow not overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
It's fascinating. And then the end of last year, and then just this spring, I read Circe and Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller.
Yeah,
and
great books.
It's kind of hard. Like, can you call somebody one of your favorite authors when you've only read 2 books? But I would not need a book pitch. If somebody would be like, "Oh, Madeline came out with a new book," and I'd be like, "Okay, sign me up. I'm buying it." Mm-hmm. No questions asked.
What was it about those books that really gripped you?
Oh man, I mean, I think Madeline Miller, easy. Like I'm a huge mythology buff. I took I dropped it when I went to high school, but I took Latin in elementary school. My God, can you imagine? Middle school, I did Latin because I loved mythology so much. And so kind of getting that modern retelling of a classic story kind of through a different lens, I think is always kind of always appealing. I think there's something like, we like repetition, we like stories where we know where it's going, but seeing it from a different angle is kind of interesting. Mm-hmm. And I think, like Stephen King, there's too much to say about about Stephen King. Like, his writing style is great, and then his stories are just so interesting. Like, a lot of times it's horror but not horror. I'm a huge Guillermo del Toro fan from the film side of things, and I don't know, have you seen Crimson Peak?
I haven't. Yes, I did, with Tom Hiddleston.
Yes, Hiddleston. Yes. So there's that, the female main character, she's writing this book and everybody's calling it a ghost story. And she's like, no, it's not a ghost story. It's a love story with ghosts in it. And I've always felt that way about Stephen King's books. Like, they're not horror books. They're usually character dramas, but they have a lot of horror in them.
Yeah.
And I've always kind of loved that too. And then Garth Nix is just, I think Garth Nix kind of has a lot of what people kind of talked about, like Game of Thrones a little bit, where it's these big fantasy stories, but they're different. They're not just like a classic fantasy story. I think a lot of people get into Brandon Sanderson now, and I feel like I got into Garth Nix as a child and then got into Brandon Sanderson as an adult. But I think there's a lot of similarities between their world building and their magic systems and that kind of thing, how they approach the structure of their stories.
So when your author husband asks you to beta read his manuscripts, how much should he brace himself?
I think one of his favorite edits on his first first story that he had me read was I went through and highlighted all of the parentheses that he put in, and I said, get rid of these, turn them into commas. I think he got rid of maybe like one instance of them. He's learned a little bit what kind of stories I like to read. And so he kind of knows, like, oh, this is a story you'll like to read, or this is a story that I'm maybe gonna not put on your desk because it's not quite up your alley. But I think I think being an editor is fascinating. Like, I'm not an editor, but it must be so hard to try to strike that balance of cleaning up, buffing up somebody's work without altering their voice. Like the way I like to read and the way I would write is very different than how my husband writes. And so when I'm beta reading, editing, giving it a comb over, trying not to change the way he writes, but just polish it is a really hard line.
Yeah, you're right. When the editors I've worked with, I've learned so much too as a writer. I worked with one editor to polish a manuscript, and then I worked with a story producer / editor on a project. And I noticed that the thing that they both do is like they'll grammatically tell me what I need to fix, right? Or spell check. Right. But when it comes to developmental edits, it's very much this is the end goal, or this is my observation, figure out how to get to this outcome in your way. And I always found that to be such a great approach, because it caters to the individual styles of the writers.
Right. They're not less script doctoring and more, here's a problem I've noticed, you figure out how to solve it in the way that works for your story. Definitely.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so we are here today to discuss a topic that I actually heard that you wanted to talk about, and I was really excited to hear about it, which is unhappy endings. So tell me a little bit of what got you interested in that topic.
Oh man, every time we go see a movie or we finish a book, we'll be sitting in the movie theater and I'll be smiling and nodding and very much enjoying myself. And then the last 15 minutes of the movie, I'll notice my husband start looking over and looking at my face and being, are we still on board? Are you still liking how this is pulling together? Are we okay? And then the movie will end and I'll just look at him and he'll be like, oh, yeah, you didn't like that ending, did you? I am notoriously super picky about my endings.
Okay.
Yeah.
I hate when there's a sad ending and they don't give me enough recovery time to stop crying. So I'm like, if there's something sad, like let's pick any Marvel movie, there's always like a downturn, right? They always want to make you cry at some point, and usually it's not the very ending. So I'm thankful, because I'll cry and then I'll be like, all right, I've got some time to dry out a little bit until the lights come up.
Yeah, you need a minute to pick yourself back up before you walk out of the theater, for sure.
Sure. So then I'll start that one over. So when we talk about happy ever afters, it's that ending that we come to expect, especially as we're growing up from childhood into adulthood. And then we start getting exposed to different kinds of endings. Sometimes they're trying to make a point, a life lesson, or they're just trying to make you sad and embarrassed as you leave the theater with tears coming down your face. So what circumstances does a story call for an unhappy ending? When is it a good job?
My knee-jerk reaction is to say always. I love a in air quotes bad ending, not like a poorly executed ending, but where you're like, ooh, that didn't go well. I think it depends a lot on what kind of story you're telling, obviously. Like no one's going to be happy if their rom-com has an unhappy ending. That's not what you showed up for.
And that is the rule, right? For romantic genres, that happy ever after is part of the genre. And if you're not going to have a happy ending, then it's a different genre.
Yeah, I think I think that's fair. Unless, sometimes if you're telling like a period drama romance, you
Mm-hmm.
can sometimes get away with a little bit more of a mixed bag ending. But definitely, yeah, that's kind of genre baked into the genre. Um, but as I mentioned Brandon Sanderson earlier, my husband watched a bunch of his lectures that he had recorded and put up on YouTube. And he has this great thing. It's not specifically about endings, it's about sort of all the different climaxes, big plot points throughout a novel or a story. And he has this great thing where he calls it a yes, but, or a no, and.
Mm.
And so the yes, but is like your hero's successful, but there's something goes wrong or there's some sort of fallout in order to maintain tension and interest. And then it's more interesting when they have a complete triumph later. And then there's a no, and, which is we failed. And there's like a pretty negative repercussion for that failure. And I feel like the happily ever after good endings is like a yes, and
Okay.
we achieved our goal and everything's great now. And it's kind of
Mm-hmm.
just like that's not really how life works.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
It's like
and
the
it's kind
happily
of
ever
like,
after is too soon in the ending when it comes to real
yeah,
life.
yeah. I mean, you think about even like the fairy tales growing up, they get married, they ride off into the sunset, and it's like happily ever after. It's like, okay, but like after they've been married for 5 years, is it still happily ever after? Do they argue about who's doing the dishes?
Mm-hmm.
This story doesn't end. Story doesn't end here. Story keeps going. And life is usually, even when things are going well, there's usually something that's not going well at the
Mm-hmm.
same time. Um, and I think it's just a little bit more, it's more interesting. There's just more depth and believability, I guess, to
Mm-hmm.
a story when things end on that sort of negative note or a mixed note.
It definitely seems like the unhappy ending is effective in teaching someone the impacts. The most recent one, and I know this one was very controversial when it came out, Don't Look Up on Netflix.
Yeah. Yes.
It's the story of two scientists that discover an asteroid's coming for us. And they go through the dog and pony show of the media and trying to get the news out
Mm-hmm.
to, various feedback. And it ends up in a lot of political confusion. And the end result is they never actually succeed in stopping the asteroid, whatever options they did have, and they all
Right.
just perish. And that was the end goal, was that if we don't act, this will be a similar result for us.
Yeah, and I think that's a great example too, because the same person that did Don't Look Up did The Big Short. And when I was, my husband was helping me prep, and we got into this whole conversation about um, do books and movies that are based on true events, do they get credit for having an unhappy ending? Because like, well, that's not a narrative choice, right? That's
Mm-hmm.
that's how it happened. But The Big Short ends with these black and white title cards. It's just text, and it's basically like, yeah, we uncovered this big banking housing crisis problem, and we called attention to it, and nothing changed. Nobody faced repercussions. They're still doing the same thing. The cycle continues. And so they definitely and it's kind of funny because those Don't Look Up and Big Short also has a lot of comedy. Like Don't Look Up is a funny movie and it's
Mm-hmm.
fun to watch,
Mm-hmm.
but it's kind of a downer too. And so it's interesting. They've really nailed the blend of figuring out how to have comedy interspersed with pretty serious, dire, negative outcomes, um, which I think that's really tricky.
Do you have any other examples of good unhappy endings?
Oh man. And this is interesting. I was looking for examples, and I think it seems like in TV and film, it's way easier to come up with outright unhappy endings. Whereas I feel like in novels, they tend to go more with that bittersweet ending.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's because it's more of a time investment reading a novel than watching a movie usually. And so, you might get pretty frustrated if you spent, 20 hours reading something and you get a catastrophic downer of an ending, but watching
Yeah.
2 hours of something is okay. But
Probably the most like, so in a good example of a bitter, so how, first of all, how would you define bittersweet as opposed to unhappy?
yeah, so I think for me, the the easiest way to sum up unhappy ending versus bittersweet is like the well, I think a good example is like the difference between Infinity War and Endgame. Kind of bringing up Marvel. Infinity Game. No one walks out of that movie with a smile on their face. Like
Mm-hmm.
you just want to go home and crawl under your blankets and cry. And Endgame, you're sad. You were probably crying 5 minutes ago, but you kind of feel okay
Mm-hmm.
about where the movie left things. Um, and I
So it's
think
bittersweet. Bittersweet. It's bitter because you're seeing some of the end of some of these stories, and sweet because you're satisfied that they won the day at least.
exactly. I think bittersweet is like we won, but at what cost?
Mm,
Whereas an unhappy ending is we paid the same cost, but we didn't win.
gotcha.
I think your protagonist or your hero dying is a kind of part of a benchmark of whether or not it's an unhappy ending or not. But sometimes the hero dies in order to bring about the victory condition, if that makes sense.
Gotcha.
Um,
An example I have, I think this is bittersweet. Maybe you can tell me. Is the book Perfect Days by Rafael Montes. It came out a couple years ago. I got it as part of a book subscription service. And it was this guy writes horror, and his mom said, "Why can't you just write a good romance? Like, why are you so dark?" So he's like,
that sounds like my
"Okay."
mother-in-law.
He writes Perfect Days, which is it's told from the perspective of a psychopath who falls in love with a girl, and it's his way. Like, if you think of your typical, like, you fall in love with someone, you seduce them, you spend time together, you get married, children, right? It is the same
Mhm.
exact timeline, except he is holding her against her will. And it's like
Oh wow.
it's a thriller. So then you're reading it and you're like, what really trying to get her, like, hoping that she can escape. And terrible, like, I'm reading this, I'm like, what did I subscribe to? It was just like one of those monthly things where they gave me the book, and it was on the top list for a while. And at the end, you think she finally escaped until they get into a car wreck and she has amnesia. So then he goes to the hospital and pretends that they've been together this whole time. They end up getting married and have children. She has no idea
Oh my
everything they
goodness.
went through, except that every now and then she has nightmares. And she clearly
Wow.
demonstrates PTSD. But they're together and in this warped romance. Oh my gosh, it's just, I finished
Oh
the
my
book
gosh.
and I was like, I wanted to throw the book across. It was like one of those books where I was like, I have to get rid of this book.
Yes. Yes. Well, and I think that brings up a really good point. So I think there's a big difference between endings which end poorly for the protagonist, but we kind of enjoy it,
Mhm.
versus endings like that where it ends badly and we're unhappy about it, right? Like
Yeah.
sometimes there's almost this kind of like bizarre, sick. It's fun to watch our heroes fail because there's no stakes to it. Um, it's not real people actually going through hardship and having a hard time. Um, and sometimes it's kind of interesting to watch that happen. But then sometimes there's an ending. You're like, I'm I'm not okay with that.
Mhm.
Like that's unacceptable. Yeah, for sure. I think for me, we watched a movie last fall called Promising Young Woman, I think is what it's called. Um, and it's it's the story of this this young woman, it's kind of like a revenge quest, with a big, feminist bent to it. Her best friend went through something, and she's kind of getting back at all the men that were involved, and she achieves her goal. The ringleader of what happened, he gets his comeuppance, and he ends up getting arrested at the end of the movie, but she dies.
Oh.
Yeah, and we watched it, and I was so upset. I was so mad. I was like, this is not okay. This whole movie was about like getting your vengeance for this, misogynistic trauma thing. And it ends with her getting killed by the same man that caused the original trauma. And you're like,
Mm.
that's not fair. That's not okay.
Was that a
And then
good
when you kind
example
of
of a bad ending then? Or was that a bad ending or an unhappy ending or both?
Well, so it's kind of tricky. Like technically, by my metrics, it would count as more of a bittersweet ending because she did sort of accomplish her goal.
Okay.
He all the men wind up being punished. He goes to prison. Everybody knows what happened. Um, and her death is sort of what brings that about. So it's almost like the noble sacrifice kind of thing.
I see. Okay.
And when I stopped and looked back on it a couple weeks later, objectively, like, yeah, I can see how this ending works narratively, but I still don't like it. I'm still not happy with it.
No.
Not
Well,
happy about it.
it was an example of what was that structure where the protagonist accomplished their goal but died.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. You're just like,
Okay.
oh, that's all right. And you don't even get to you don't get to see your victory.
Okay.
Yeah.
That other examples of that I came up with where the whole they succeeded, but you have Gladiator, who
Yes.
Maximus dies at the end after
Mm-hmm.
avenging a bunch of stuff, but no, he oh, sorry, I should rephrase that. He avenges a lot of things and succeeds in the end, but dies. But I guess that's
Yeah.
bittersweet because he kind of had a death wish ever since his child and wife died, and so then he gets to see them in the end. Bittersweet.
Right. Right. Um, it's I tried so hard to come up with examples that weren't horror.
Okay.
um, and because I think that's sort of going back to your early question about what stories deserve to have an unhappy ending or a bad ending. And I think horror flat out.
Mm.
I remember the first horror movie that I saw as like a teenager slash adult that really scared the pants off me. It's called Quarantine, which has a whole new whole new tone to that word now. But it's an American remake of a Spanish horror movie, but it's basically kind of like a Blair Witch found footage situation in a apartment building, and there's some virus outbreak that kind of is maybe like rabies, and it's not quite zombie but kind of zombie-esque, and everybody dies. The
Did they
last
stop the quarantine? I haven't seen this movie, so I
Well,
don't know.
you don't
No.
know. So
Oh.
yeah, so like it's this film crew, and I don't remember why they're in this building, but all this weird stuff starts happening, and then the city comes in and puts the building into quarantine and isn't letting anybody out, and they're not telling them what's going on. And it sort of just gets it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And then the last scene of the movie, the camera is in night vision because she's in this weird basement, creepy room, and drops the camera. And so the camera's on the ground, she's on the ground, crawling towards the camera, and then she gets pulled back out of frame, and it just ends.
Oh.
Yeah. And I just remember absolutely flipping my lid when the credits started rolling.
Oh.
I had never seen a horror movie with no survivors before. And it totally changes things, right? Because if you kind of go into like the Conjuring movies, love them to death. Ed and Lorraine Warren aren't dying because they're real people, and they were alive until pretty recently. And so sometimes it's kind of like the stakes are a little bit lower because they're not in any real danger. And I think that was the big thing, even though this wasn't an ending. In Game of Thrones, when they kill Ned Stark, all of a sudden the bar gets raised because now, if they're going to kill him, they could kill anybody.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, all of these situations where there's even a threat of danger to the characters, you're actually afraid for the characters all the time because they've set that standard that death is actually an option on the table. So I think movies like that kind of stick with you a little bit more because we don't expect that.
Yeah, I like that too, because it subverts a lot of tropes that you're watching and you're expecting, certain things. And that's what I love about watching movies and stories throughout the ages. You recognize tropes that are persistent, and then you see every now and then things get flipped on its head a little bit. And especially with pop culture, because I know that a lot of things aren't new, but pop culture specifically, the era of grittiness, for example, that started, I think, 15 years ago. And then also the anti-hero with Mad Men and Breaking Bad, The Sopranos, all that era. I love that. So Game of Thrones brought in the era of your loved one probably could die, and now you're feeling just as freaked out as if you were in that world yourself.
Right. Kind of gets rid of this idea of plot armor. And I think the tropes thing, one of my favorite movies is Seven, directed by David Fincher. And it's a procedural cop serial killer drama movie. And it's Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman, and they're trying to catch this serial killer guy. And they do. They catch him. And in most movies, that's where the movie would end. But the movie doesn't end there. It keeps going past that point, and we get the classic Brad Pitt what's in the box scene, and you find out that the villain has killed the wife of one of our main characters. He winds up then killing the villain, and the movie ends with him getting arrested. And Morgan Freeman, who is supposed to be retiring, and he's going to train this younger detective to kind of fill his shoes and carry on the mantle, has just been disgraced, and he's probably going to be in prison for the rest of his life. That's not how you expect a cop drama to end.
No. What do you think was the intent for that? Do you think the intent was just to mess with the viewers as much as possible?
Yeah, probably. I mean, and I think, that kind of goes back to the grittiness that was definitely at the peak of that kind of era. The whole movie is so, I mean, it's a serial killer movie. It's obviously dark.
Mhm.
But definitely, like, I think it was just supposed to be a very psychological horror movie masquerading as a cop drama.
Yes. Yeah. And I do
Yeah.
think that fans of the genre, they're like, surprise me. I want to be surprised. And there's that pressure
Mhm.
now for creatives to
Yeah.
go, you have to set up this faux plot line to then have the rug ripped under you for the real plot line, which is challenging. It's really challenging to do. It makes it a puzzle for the writers.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, for sure. And you can't like shoehorn it in. I feel like, it needs to be, it needs to serve a point. It needs to
Mhm.
serve the narrative. It can't just be for a gotcha, I guess. Um,
What other examples do you have for the unhappy ending?
so the one that I found, and I have to give the caveat that I haven't actually read the book. I've watched the movie, but from the research I gleaned that they align is atonement.
Oh,
Are
okay.
you are
I
you
have done both.
familiar?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm glad
So
you brought this up. Okay, go ahead.
yeah, so the whole plot is, starts with this young girl, Bryony, and she wrongfully accuses her sister's lover of committing sexual assault, and he goes to prison, and then he's fighting in the war, and you get this scene kind of years later where she's now an adult woman and she has recognized the mistake she made, and she's trying to kind of do penance for it, and you get this reunion scene with her and her sister and her lover, and they kind of refuse to forgive her. She's like, yeah, I get it. That's fair. Even though you won't forgive me, I'm going to try to have you exonerated. And you're kind of like, okay, well, this is great. Like, she's taking ownership for it. She's going to set things right. This is great. And then the last little segment of the story is Bryony as an older woman. She's like in her 70s, and you find out she's an author, and this whole story you've been reading is her retelling this story, and that last little segment never happened. They never got reunited. They in fact both died these horribly tragic, miserable deaths, and she herself is dying of vascular dementia.
Mm.
But it's really interesting because she has this, I think in the book it's like a diary entry, and in the movie it's an interview, and they're like, why did you make this scene up? And she basically is like, well, I didn't want to give the readers a bummer of an ending, and you know my sister and her lover never got to be together, and so I'm making up for it by giving their characters the happy ending that they didn't get to have. But then, as the actual reader or viewer, you're like, oh, but you just gave us a bummer of an ending.
Yeah.
This sucks.
I tell you, I will say that ending is probably why that movie lives on in my head
Yes.
and why
And that and the green dress. Yeah.
yeah. Oh, the green dress. I love that green dress so much. Iconic, the entire
Yeah.
movie. And everyone was so well cast in it.
Mhm.
Fantastically filmed. But yes, that ending messed me up. And
Yeah.
it's crazy because it's not just a romance story that overcomes some sort of obstacle. It becomes like a real look at guilt
Yes.
and Bryony's just her mental ability capacity for processing what she did. It was just amazing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think that movie is phenomenal on every layer. Um, but it's interesting because it kind of goes into it kind of gets a little meta with the ending about,
Mm-hmm.
do authors owe the readers a good ending, or is the authentic ending more appropriate?
Yeah. And it comes into account what you said earlier about happy endings aren't how real life works. And you hear much more, especially during times of war, tragedies,
Right.
where in his case, he died from, I think it was, I'm trying to remember, hypothermia, or he was just exposed to the elements, was injured and just died
Yeah.
while he
Yeah.
was sleeping. And then she died hiding in the sewers or the pipes, and
Mhm.
a bombing overhead broke the water main or something, and they all drowned.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
was like, oh,
Yeah.
I didn't realize that's what I was getting into when I watched the movie. And
Right.
that was a movie where I was ugly crying and had to wait a little bit before I could get
Yes.
up and walk out.
Well, and I think the thing now, I haven't read the book, but in the movie, not only does she tell you, yeah, oh, that never happened, they actually then show you the scenes of what happens to them. So
Mm-hmm.
you don't just hear her tell you about it, you actually watch it happen.
Oh,
Oh God, this is such a bummer.
yes. And then they create a hypothetical scene where they're at the cabin that they always want to be
Yes.
at by the shore, and they're
Yep.
happy. And then you're looking at what could have been, and then you feel robbed of that
Yes.
experience.
Yep, exactly.
Oh, heartbreaking. Yes, that was on my list as well.
Heartbreaking, but like if the movie ended, if you never got that, oh, here's what really happened, and it just ended with that scene of them like, kissing at sunset by the sea in their cabin, you'd be like, oh, that was a cute movie, but
Mm-hmm.
like you wouldn't still be thinking about it 5 years
No,
later.
not at all. So, are there any stories that you've seen with who tried to do the unhappy ending and they did not do well? It felt like more gratuitous than meaningful.
So I had a really hard time with this one actually, and I think the thing is that it's such a gamble, and it's kind of so risky that I think storytellers don't don't go that route unless they're really sure that it's going to serve their narrative. Um,
Okay. I had a
but in
hard
a
time thinking of that too.
Yeah,
It was a hard question.
but in a different kind of storytelling medium, I think video game endings can feel that way sometimes.
Okay.
So when you are reading a book or watching a movie, you can have feelings about the characters that are different, that come from your own thoughts and preconceived notions. But a lot of the moral judgment of what's happening comes from the narrator or the author or the director in terms of how the story's told and how things are presented to you. But when you're playing a video game, like you are the main character.
Mm-hmm.
And especially there's a lot of games that have a lot of role playing aspects where your choices actually have some sort of impact on the narrative of the story. You know, there's things all the way on the Mass Effect side of the spectrum where you're controlling almost every outcome. My husband and I both played the trilogy, and we have completely different games, or things where you get more micro choices that might have a different tone to the ending, but the plot of the game is still the same.
Mm-hmm.
And in those kind of games, I get frustrated when you have the quote unquote bad ending, because it kind of feels like a little finger waggy. Like, oh, you were bad, you shot a civilian, we're going to punish you by giving you the bad ending.
Mm.
um
Yeah, it's kind
one
of
of
you feel a little cheated
Yeah,
all the hard work you did.
yeah, I was explaining this to my dad, and one of the games that I haven't played, but I watched my husband play. is Dishonored, and that has kind of like the good ending, and then there's two different bad endings. And I was explaining it to my dad, and the best thing that I knew my dad could remotely relate to was the movie Taken. I was like, imagine if Liam Neeson went through all the stuff in the movie, all the indiscriminate violence, and then at the end, like he gets his daughter back, but then she winds up dying as like punishment for all the indiscriminate violence. And you're like, well, then what was the point of the last 2 hours? What did we do that for? And I think, you know, there's an argument to be made that like, well, sometimes life is just like that. And sometimes there is no point. But I think when you're playing the game, you're like, hey, you gave me agency and choice and control over the narrative, and now you're punishing me for the choices that I made. That's why'd you let me make this choice then?
It becomes like a what's the word I'm thinking about? An ethical teaching moment, but who's the teacher?
Exactly. And that's the thing where it's like, you know, if you're watching a movie or reading a story and it's supposed to be this kind of parable morality lesson kind of thing, like, okay, well, this is a morality lesson from the viewpoint of the author, and this is the author's take on it. But when you have a video game thing, it's kind of like, okay, you've got to balance the developer's opinion with the choices that the player's going to make. I'm like, oh.
That's a really good point. So then inversely, are there happy endings, or were there happy endings that you saw that should have been unhappy endings that would have made a better story?
Yes. This is the moment I've been waiting for. Harry Potter.
Okay. Tell me all about it.
Done. Oh my gosh. So there's two, I have two different, well, I have so many gripes with Harry Potter, but in this lens, I have two big ones. So there's, should Harry have died, is kind of like my first gripe. Like, I remember reading the books, and when we learned about the whole shtick with Horcruxes, I remember looking at my mom because we were reading it together, and I was like, oh, Harry's gonna have to die in order for this to work. And then you get to the book and it's like, he kind of dies, and we get this weird like soul meet up with Dumbledore. You have a choice to pass on and go to the afterlife and be done with all this, or you can go back and keep fighting and finish it out. And he chooses to go back and keep fighting, and that somehow like works to get rid of the Horcrux, which like doesn't really make sense with the rules we've previously established. And you know, I felt like she kind of pulled her punches a little bit on that, and it's like we kind of were 1 foot in, 1 foot out. He needed to die, but we didn't really want to kill him, and ooh, what are we going to do with this? And I felt like it was weaker than if she had gone full tilt in either direction.
I see that because when you look at the Horcruxes and the other items, you full on destroy the items to get. And Harry, his Horcrux was plot armor. Like when you're playing video games and you get your shield taken down, that was the Horcrux.
Yep, exactly. And then even like if you want to even say like, okay, we're not going to kill Harry Potter, fine. You get this epilogue, and I hated the epilogue. Like if she had just ended the book without the epilogue, I probably would have been okay with it.
Remind me, was the epilogue at the train station?
Yeah, okay. It's this 19 years later, and everybody is dropping their kids off to go to Hogwarts, and like Harry and Ginny are married, Ron and Hermione are married, they have kids, they even like catch a glimpse of Draco Malfoy like from across the crowd, and it's all super cheery, like autumn core, you know, like the sun is shining and everybody's all happy. Like the last lines of the book are literally, his scar hasn't pained him in 19 years. All was well.
Mm.
How can all be well?
Yeah, it's a good, especially because it got so deep into the breakdown of society, and not just like because Dumbledore's back, but like she unpacked how society is untrusting, the
Mm-hmm.
confusion. There's like a lot of truths in those things. So I'm glad to hear that. I guess the demise of Dumbledore, I mean, everything is fine, but it does seem kind of interesting that it had such a happy ending. Also, I'm thinking like how perfectly executed to have everyone come together at the same time and everyone decided to have children, to
Yeah.
carry on this legacy.
Well, and I think the best inverse of that is the ending of the Hunger Games, the last book of the Hunger Games, Mockingjay.
Yeah.
So, same thing, it does a flash forward epilogue, and from the outside, it looks really idyllic. It's her and Peeta sitting in this beautiful sunlit meadow, watching their children play with no threat of danger. Like, it looks beautiful and it looks like happily ever after. But then, because it's told from a first person point of view, Katniss is talking about, like, A, I was terrified to have kids, and it took me 15 years to be emotionally ready to have children. B, I know my kids are going to learn about all the things I've done at some point, and how do I explain this to them? And is this going to change their opinion of me? And C, I still have nightmares about what I did and what happened to me. And the ending of Mockingjay, she talks about how when she has bad days, she like plays this game of listing all the good things that have happened to her. And she says, there are much worse games to play. And so
Mm-hmm.
it ends on a happy note. We've achieved victory, but she's recalling her trauma and like it's still with her. You just think about all the things that happened in Harry Potter,
Mm-hmm.
and it's like there's no way that the Golden Trio would not have some degree of pretty significant PTSD after all that jazz.
Do you think Harry could have been a good Auror, having gone through all that
Oh,
trauma?
so well, there's two things. Like there's a, without getting into cursed child
Let's ignore that
territory.
one. I read that once and I'm like, never
we're
again.
gonna we're gonna I read the Wikipedia plot synopsis and I was like, oh no, I'm not even gonna touch this. Yes, I think Harry being an Auror or something like that, where he, used his skills and kind of, I think Harry would have been more likely to be the kind of hero that was so used to war that he couldn't be at peace.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Kind of like Gladiator, right? Like Maximus would not have had a happy life if he didn't die at the end of that movie.
Yeah.
He would have achieved his goals, but he wouldn't have had anything left to really live for or to strive for. And I think literally since the time Harry was old enough to have any sort of self-concept, literally his role, his purpose for existing was to defeat Voldemort. And what do you do after I mean, you're what, 18, 19, and you've accomplished what you were born to do? Then what?
Hopefully therapy, because I
Like
feel like
you
there's
know you get married to your high school sweetheart who is also your best friend's little sister, and your two
Mhm.
best friends get married and you all have a bunch of kids, and like everything's super happy and hunky dory. Like I'm not really sure that that's how that goes.
No, I would imagine that there would be a huge distrust in authority, and you
Yeah.
can't trust like the very system that has to continue. You had to break it down,
Hmm.
and I could see how that would have continuing effects. The fact that, there's trauma already associated with growing up with the Dursleys and
Yes.
now becoming a father figure. That's what I feel like that's when all the traumas start to crash in on you.
Oh yeah.
Uh, I almost feel like that's kind of an interesting take. And it's been a while since I've read Harry Potter and the Cursed Child. I don't even remember if they addressed
Oh
those
God.
things. I just,
No, no, I don't even know. And I mean, and I think the epilogue Harry Potter thing, I mean, it even goes into like the naming of their children. Um, and this is like a whole nother big can of worms, that my husband hates every time I kind of pop the lid off of it. But like, he named his kid after Albus Dumbledore, who, in my opinion, was like, you know, committed emotional child abuse,
mhm, I agree.
through what he did to Harry. Like, at best, negligent, at worst, massive abuse of power. Um, and it's like, oh man, like he named his kid after him. Like, this really just shows like a complete lack of ability to really analyze people and their motives and all this kind of stuff. So
Yeah.
I have so many problems with Harry Potter as an adult. As a kid, I was like, as a kid, I was like mad that Harry didn't die, and I didn't like the ending, but I was like, whatever. And then when I was in my like mid-20s, I reread the series, and I was like, oh God, there's so many problems with this. Like, not even going into like the, author problems, but even just contained within the story. You're just like, ooh, this is maybe not great. We've got
Yeah,
some problems here.
absolutely. Yeah, it makes me think of like Ariel, like, because you have a perspective when you're a kid, Little Mermaid. And I was like,
Yes.
I identify with Ariel. She just wants her independence. And then I watch it as an adult and I'm like, oh man, I am kind of siding with her father right now. She's a little
Yes.
impulsive. And while he shouldn't be destroying her things, obviously, and maybe shouldn't have such a chokehold on her behavior, but um it's an interesting perspective seeing things from the adult view.
Oh man, we have a almost 3-year-old, and we've been watching the classic Disney movies with her, and 100% as a parent watching Disney movies, like, oh man, the Disney formula is like, child says, I'm gonna do X. Parent is like, no, you can't do that for some very well reasoned purposes. You cannot do that. And kid is like, I'm going to do it anyway. And then by the end of the movie, the parent is like, oh, yeah, you know what? You were right. I've come around to your point of view, and I'm now going to support you in your pursuit of this. And it's like, not sure that that's the expectation I want to set.
Yeah. so so you're a reader, and from a reader's perspective, being able to consume unhappy, bittersweet, happy endings, what's some good advice or tips or ideas for writers to keep in mind as they're deciding whether or not to write an unhappy ending?
I mean, I think part of it, kind of like what we were talking about readers kind of wanting to be surprised or expecting things to be subverted, is, I mean, and this kind of just goes for everything, like every big decision in a story, but making sure it actually serves the narrative and it's not just there for shock value, I guess.
Yeah.
I mean, I think when you read a story, I feel like you can tell whether or not the author or the storyteller buys into their ending or not. Like, I feel like I remember reading somewhere that when J.K. Rowling was initially writing Harry Potter, she had meant for him to die,
Mm.
but then got there and couldn't do it. And I think that shows in the writing, because it's like narratively everything led up to that, but then she pulled back. And same thing, I think, if you write an unhappy ending or a bittersweet ending, but it's just there because you didn't want to have a trite tie everything up in a bow ending. If you haven't left the breadcrumbs for that ending, I think it can maybe just feel kind of slapped on in the end.
Mm-hmm.
I think the bittersweet ending is like the way to go a little bit. I think a happy ending, some people are going to be unhappy with a happy ending, me included. um, but then at the same time, there's people who, they're using fiction as a way to escape the daily problems, and they need things to end on a happy note, and they're going to be really unhappy and feel robbed and cheated by a quote unquote bad ending.
Mm-hmm.
But if you do a bittersweet ending, it's kind of like, okay, well, you get your victory. You get to feel like there's hope and you succeeded, but there's enough sorrow in it that it feels believable and it feels real, and it's kind of grounded.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really good advice. I think a good example of a movie that I think pissed off a lot of people with their ending because it felt like it was planned by committee. So then you had what probably could have been a good ending, but then people got involved and then, money got involved, was what is it called? Is it the Skywalker?
Rise of Skywalker, yeah.
The Last Skywalker, right?
Yeah.
I'm like, I get all the names of all the Star Wars. Like at some point, I'm gonna be like the Phantom Skywalker. It's just gonna devolve from there.
Yeah.
But the part where the Kylo Ren and I already have opinions about the Emperor coming back, but and Rey's association with that. But Kylo Ren and Rey's ending, where a lot, like, you could tell that they were fighting two different camps. You had people who loved Reylo and people who hated it and thought it wasn't even part of the story. And so they appeased it by having this kind of chaste kiss, killed him off. But then people were saying, if you pay attention to the footage, it looks reversed. It looks like there was a lot of doctoring to, after the fact, change the ending. And regardless of whether or not that's true, I think people felt that tug of war between the different factions of what the plot should have been. And maybe they were trying to please too many people at once. And it just ended, to me, I was just like, what did I just watch?
Yeah. And I mean, I think there's so many things about the sequel trilogy where you could say that of trying to, the pendulum swings so far in one direction or the other, whether we're trying to do something new or whether we're trying to recall the nostalgia. And I mean, I think that's just, when you're working with a franchise, it's almost impossible to strike that balance the right way. You're gonna make someone very unhappy, and you're probably going to make a lot of people very unhappy. But yeah, I wanted a different ending for Rise of Skywalker, but I was okay. I was okay with the end of Rey's story. I would have liked a different ending for Kylo Ren, but
yeah. So thank you so much for being on this episode to talk about unhappy endings. Is there any last words or anything you want to promote or push?
Ooh, want to promote my husband.
Perfect.
check him out. But no, thank you for having me on here. Thank you for having a non-writer ramble about what writers should do.
I think it's great because then the writers that are listening can go, oh, this is what the reader's thinking, which is really helpful. Speculative Sandbox is a volunteer-run podcast that relies on the collaboration of fellow creators like you. Join the conversation and participate in fun polls and questionnaires on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. Interested in being in a future episode? Our DMs are open, or you can email speculativesandbox@gmail.com.